Ricardo Vasconcellos, a millionaire businessman, self-assured and arrogant, lives in a world where appearances are everything. During a lavish party, he makes a cruel bet to win over and marry Clara, a sweet and charismatic woman often mocked for her unconventional appearance. Unaware of Ricardo's intentions, Clara accepts his advances, believing she's found the love she always dreamed of. But as the relationship progresses, Ricardo discovers something in Clara that he never expected. The room was filled with golden lights and shimmering crystal, an opulence only the rich could afford. Ricardo Vasconcellos stood at the center of attention, his confident smile and easy demeanor radiating the aura of a man who had never known defeat. Holding a glass of whiskey, he laughed at his friends' jokes about the less suitable guests at the elitist event. "Her, over there," one of the men said, nodding toward Clara. She sat alone near a window, gazing at the rain with a melancholic air, her simple dress standing out among the expensive gowns and sparkling jewels. "Clara Gomez?" Ricardo raised an eyebrow, vaguely recognizing her. "Doesn't she work as an assistant at some NGO?" "That's right. Always walking around with that do-gooder vibe." The group chuckled. "I bet she's never had a proper date in her life." The laughter echoed cruelly, but Ricardo simply smirked. Known for taking on any challenge, no matter how absurd, he raised his glass, a calculated glint in his eye. "Well, maybe it's time to change that. I bet I can have her married to me in less than 6 months." The group fell silent for a moment, then burst into laughter, clinking glasses in agreement. But as Ricardo approached Clara with his rehearsed charm, he didn't realize he was about to cross a line that would change his life forever. Clara was lost in thought, watching raindrops slide down the glass. High society events weren't her scene. She was there only because her boss had insisted, claiming it would be a good opportunity to make connections for the NGO where she championed social causes. Still, she felt out of place, like a puzzle piece that didn't fit. "Not a fan of parties, huh?" The voice was smooth, confident. She looked up to find Ricardo Vasconcellos, a man who seemed to have stepped straight off the cover of a magazine. His charming smile made her cheeks flush. "Not exactly my favorite place," she replied, trying to sound casual. "What about you? You seem to enjoy being the center of attention." Ricardo chuckled, and Clara was surprised at how pleasant the sound was. They began talking, and to her astonishment, he seemed genuinely interested in what she had to say. He praised her work at the NGO, asked about her life, and cracked jokes that made her laugh in a way she hadn't in a long time. When Ricardo suggested dinner the following week, Clara hesitated. Men like him, charming, successful, and clearly used to getting what they wanted, weren't part of her usual reality. But something in his gaze made her say yes. As she walked away that night, her heart racing and a smile on her lips, Ricardo watched her silhouette fade into the rain. A wave of satisfaction swept over him. The game had begun, but something about Clara's sincerity made him, for a fleeting moment, question his own bet. The first week after the party was full of surprises. Ricardo sent flowers to Clara's workplace and called her daily with creative excuses to hear her voice. At first, Clara was hesitant to open up, but his attention seemed so genuine that she gradually let her guard down. For their dinner date, Ricardo chose a cozy restaurant, far from the ostentatious venues he usually frequented. Clara arrived in a simple yet elegant dress, and Ricardo was struck by the sparkle in her eyes. For the first time in years, he felt a twinge of nervousness. "I thought you'd take me to one of those restaurants where you can't even pronounce the menu items," Clara teased, glancing around. Ricardo laughed. "I wanted a place where we could really talk. After all, you intrigued me at that party." Clara blushed, though she couldn't shake a small sense of disbelief. She had spent much of her life being ignored or, worse, mocked. Yet Ricardo seemed different. He didn't avert his gaze, and his smile felt warm. Their conversation flowed naturally, and Ricardo found himself captivated by Clara's passion for her work. She shared heartfelt stories about the lives she had impacted through the NGO, and her words stirred something deep within him, a part of himself he barely recognized. To Clara, that dinner marked the beginning of something special. But Ricardo was fighting an internal battle. He knew he was lying, that it was all part of a cruel game he had devised. Yet he couldn't help but admire Clara's authenticity. She was unlike the women he usually encountered, who wore social masks. Her honesty disarmed him at every turn. When Ricardo dropped her off that night, Clara thanked him with a warm smile and stepped inside, unaware that he lingered outside for a moment, staring at her closed door and feeling a strange heaviness in his chest. In the days that followed, their meetings became more frequent, strolls in the park, afternoons in cozy coffee shops, and even attending charity events organized by Clara. She began to see a softer side of Ricardo, one he rarely showed. "You're different, you know?" Clara remarked one afternoon as they walked through a park. "Different how?" he asked, genuinely curious. "I'm not sure. It's like there's more to you than what people see at first glance." She smiled. "I think we're alike in that way." Ricardo remained silent, her words striking a chord deep within him. For the first time in years, he felt truly seen. But reality crept in during solitary moments. In his luxurious penthouse, sipping whiskey, he stared at his reflection in the mirror. The bet loomed over him like a dark cloud. He couldn't decide if he was losing himself in the game or if Clara was irresistibly winning him over. Meanwhile, Clara was beginning to believe she had finally found love. Her friends noticed the change in her mood, the lightness in her step. But fate had already set the stage for an inevitable reckoning, a moment when truths would be revealed, and hearts would be tested. The months passed like a dream for Clara. Ricardo seemed to be everything she never thought she'd find: attentive, funny, and, above all, genuinely interested in who she truly was. She often found herself smiling, reminiscing about their moments together, like when he helped organize an event for her NGO or when they spent lazy afternoons talking about her favorite books. "Let's play a game with those who only read the comments." Type restaurant in the comments if you've read this far. We'll know who's really following along. Now let's continue the story while we wait. Ricardo, on the other hand, felt the weight of the bet tightening around his neck like a noose. He had never intended for the game to go this far. Marriage had seemed like an absurd idea at first, something he'd abandon halfway through, but Clara disarmed him more each day. He was torn between guilt and a growing feeling he hesitated to name. One winter evening, he made a decision. Sitting by the fireplace in his penthouse, the flames reflecting in his nearly empty glass of whiskey, he promised himself he would end the bet. He needed to tell her the truth and put an end to this before he hurt Clara any more, and himself. The following evening, Ricardo invited Clara to dinner. The restaurant, more upscale this time, seemed like the perfect setting for what he planned to say. Clara arrived wearing a red dress that made her shine even brighter than usual. Ricardo couldn't take his eyes off her, his chest tightening with guilt. "You're quiet tonight," Clara said, placing her hand over his on the table. "Did something happen?" Ricardo opened his mouth to speak, but before he could respond, a familiar voice interrupted. "Ricardo, what a surprise seeing you here." It was Fernando, one of the friends involved in the bet. He was grinning awkwardly, clearly a little drunk. "And this must be the famous Clara?" Fernando extended his hand, but there was something in his tone that made Clara frown. "Yes, that's me," she replied politely, but Ricardo noticed the unease in her voice. Fernando seemed on the verge of saying something, but Ricardo abruptly stood up. "Let's go, Clara. I think we're done here." "Done?" Clara looked at her barely touched plate, then back at Ricardo. "What's going on?" Ricardo couldn't respond. He simply took her hand and guided her out of the restaurant, his heart pounding. He knew Fernando was dangerously close to revealing something he didn't want Clara to find out that way. In the car, Clara finally broke the silence. "Ricardo, please talk to me. It's clear something's wrong." He parked the car on a deserted street, sighing deeply. Everything inside him screamed to tell the truth right then and there, but the words felt stuck in his throat. He held her hand tightly. "Clara, I need to tell you something, but I don't know where to start." "Then start at the beginning," she said, her smile encouraging him. But before he could speak, Clara's phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen and saw a message from a friend. It was a photo taken at the restaurant, showing Fernando in the background, surrounded by Ricardo's other friends. The caption read only 2 words, "The bet." Clara's world froze. She looked at Ricardo, who immediately understood what had happened. "Clara, I can explain." "Explain what? That all of this was a game? That I was a joke to you and your friends?" Her words cut like knives, but Ricardo knew she was right. "At first, it was a bet, yes," he admitted, his voice heavy with regret. "But everything changed." "I changed?" Clara laughed bitterly, tears streaming down her face. "Changed? That doesn't erase the fact that you used me." She opened the car door and stepped out, leaving Ricardo alone, staring into the emptiness. For the first time in his life, he felt the unbearable weight of his choices, and loneliness enveloped him like a dense fog. Clara walked through the cold streets, her heart shattered. She didn't know where she was going, but she knew something inside her had broken in a way that might never be repaired. The days that followed were a blur for Clara. Discovering the bet had shattered not only her trust in Ricardo but also her confidence in herself. She withdrew, avoiding friends and turning down invitations to go out. Even her work at the NGO, which had always brought her joy, became an arduous task. One rainy afternoon, Clara sat on the couch in her small living room, surrounded by tissue boxes and cups of cold tea. Her best friend, Luisa, barged in without knocking. "All right, that's enough," Luisa declared, yanking the blanket off Clara. "You're going to tell me what's going on right now?" Clara tried to resist, but her friend's persistence won. Between sobs and fragmented words, Clara spilled everything: the bet, the humiliation, and how she had genuinely believed Ricardo loved her. Luisa remained silent for a few moments before responding, her gaze firm. "Clara, you're not a pawn. What he did was terrible, but that doesn't define who you are. He saw something real in you, even if it started wrong. You need to remember who you are." Those words lingered with Clara in the days that followed. Though still hurt, she began finding the strength to rebuild her life. She returned to her work at the NGO with renewed determination, pouring her energy into projects that helped those in difficult circumstances. Her work became her refuge, and every smile she witnessed on the faces of those she helped was a step toward healing. Meanwhile, Ricardo was far from at peace. He had tried to reach Clara countless times, but every message and call went unanswered. He didn't blame her. He knew he deserved every bit of disdain she felt. For the first time in his life, Ricardo began questioning who he really was. The friends he'd made the bet with now seemed distant, their laughter hollow and meaningless. He withdrew from social events and started attending the same charity events Clara organized, staying on the sidelines, watching her work. At one of these events, Ricardo mustered the courage to approach her. He waited until Clara was alone, loading donation boxes into a truck. "Clara, please, just hear me out." She stopped, her gaze colder than he'd ever seen. "I have nothing to hear from you, Ricardo. I know you don't trust me, and you have every reason not to," he began, his voice trembling. "But I'm here because I want to make things right, even if you never forgive me." She crossed her arms, her expression unyielding. "Make things right? How do you fix something you've completely destroyed?" Ricardo had no ready answer. He took a deep breath. "I don't expect you to forgive me, Clara. But you need to know that what I felt for you was real." She let out a bitter laugh. "Real? After everything you've done, you still have the nerve to say that?" Ricardo lowered his head, defeated. "I know it's hard to believe, but since I met you, you've changed the way I see everything. My life was empty, Clara, and you showed me what it means to be a real person." Clara was silent for a moment, but her gaze remained hard. You want a medal for that? I'm not your redemption, Ricardo. He nodded, taking her words like the daggers he knew he deserved. I just want you to know that I'm sorry. That I'd change everything if I could. Clara didn't respond. She simply returned to her work, ignoring him. Ricardo knew there was nothing more to say at that moment. Yet he didn't give up. Instead, he began showing, through actions, that he was willing to change. At every event, he showed up, helped out, and did whatever he could to contribute to the NGO's projects. He wasn't seeking recognition, just a way to prove, to himself, more than anyone, that he could be better. Clara watched from a distance, her heart torn between resentment and reluctant admiration. She didn't know what was harder, hating him or admitting that he genuinely seemed to be changing. Winter was slowly giving way to spring, and the first rays of sunshine carried a sense of renewal that Clara wasn't sure she was ready to embrace. For months, Ricardo had remained a quiet presence in her life, always at a distance. He showed up at events, donated generously, but never tried to force conversations or get closer than necessary. Deep down, Clara was conflicted. She couldn't ignore Ricardo's dedication, but her heart still bore the scars of his betrayal. She constantly questioned whether he was genuinely trying to make amends or if it was just another game. Yet, everything about him now seemed sincere. Let's prank those who only read the comments. Type food in the comments if you've read this far. Only those who followed along will understand. Now, back to the story. It was during a major NGO event, a fundraising campaign for vulnerable families, that something shifted. Ricardo was on stage, delivering a brief but heartfelt speech about the importance of the cause. He seemed different, more humble, more human. When Clara stepped onto the stage to thank him publicly, their eyes met. For a fleeting moment, she saw something in his gaze that caught her off guard: vulnerability. After the event, while she was organizing the leftover materials, Ricardo approached her again, but this time with hesitation, almost timidly. Clara, I know I don't have the right to ask, but could we talk? Just once. No expectations, he said, his hands trembling slightly. Clara looked at him, her inner conflict evident. Finally, she sighed. All right. One conversation. They met at a cafe the next day, the same one where they'd spent happy afternoons months ago. The place was heavy with memories, but Clara remained composed while Ricardo, visibly nervous, fidgeted with his coffee cup. I know my words mean nothing compared to what I did, he began. But I need you to know how much I regret it. Not just for hurting you, but for who I was before I met you. Clara held his gaze, scrutinizing every word. Ricardo, you used me in a way I never imagined possible, she replied, her voice steady but laden with emotion. And it made me question my own worth. Do you know how much that hurts? I do, he said quickly. Because that's exactly how I feel now. Since you left my life, nothing has made sense. And I'm not saying this to ask for another chance, but because I want you to know that you changed the way I see everything. Clara stayed silent, her mind replaying all the times he had shown up over the past few months, not trying to win her back, but helping people he once wouldn't have noticed. And what do you expect me to do with that? She asked honestly. Ricardo took a deep breath. I hope you live the incredible life you deserve. And if one day you can forgive me, even if it's years from now, that would be enough. The words caught him off guard. He had never spoken so openly before, and Clara could feel it. She finished her coffee in silence and left without saying anything else, leaving Ricardo at the table with a tight knot in his chest. In the weeks that followed, Clara continued her routine, but something had shifted. Ricardo's words echoed in her mind, and she couldn't deny that he seemed like a changed man. Even so, forgiveness felt far away. Until one day, Clara received an unexpected call. A family the NGO had helped was in a critical situation, and the person who had provided significant financial support was Ricardo. He had donated anonymously, but word of the gesture reached Clara. She went to the family's home to deliver the funds and saw something that completely disarmed her. Ricardo was there, helping move furniture for the family who had just received a new home. He didn't know Clara was watching. He was doing it with no intention of impressing her. Clara felt a wave of emotion wash over her, catching her by surprise. For the first time, she realized that the man she saw before her was entirely different from the one who had made that bet months ago. In that moment, she decided to take a small step. "Ricardo," she called. He turned, startled to see her there. His eyes reflected a mix of hope and apprehension. "Can we talk again?" Ricardo set down the box he was carrying and walked toward Clara, hesitating before speaking. The air between them was heavy with tension, but something in her eyes seemed lighter, less distant than he remembered. "Of course," he replied cautiously, as though afraid to break the moment. They walked together to a nearby bench. Clara sat quietly for a moment, organizing her thoughts, while Ricardo waited patiently, resisting the urge to fill the silence. "These past months, I've watched you from afar," she began, looking down at her hands. "And I've seen you dedicate yourself to things I once doubted were genuine. I saw you helping people, even when no one was there to applaud you." Ricardo lowered his head, his shoulders relaxing slightly. "I didn't expect you to notice. I never did it to impress you." "I know," Clara said softly. "And that's what makes it all so complicated." She took a deep breath before continuing. "What you did to me, it broke me in ways I never thought I could be broken. You made me question my dignity, my ability to trust anyone." Ricardo swallowed hard. "Clara, Please, let me finish," she interrupted, and he nodded. "But it's also true that, somehow, you've changed. You're not the same man who made that bet. I see that, even if a part of me is still afraid to believe it." She finally looked up, meeting his eyes. "And that's why I'm here, to say that I want to try to forgive you." Her words left Ricardo stunned. He hadn't expected this and hadn't dared to dream it was possible. "I don't know what to say," he murmured, his voice breaking. "Don't say anything," Clara replied with a sad smile. "Forgiveness isn't something that happens overnight. And it doesn't mean things will go back to how they were. But I think you deserve a chance to show who you really are now." Ricardo nodded, his eyes glistening. For the first time, he felt a glimmer of hope, even if the road ahead was uncertain. The following months became a lesson in patience and rebuilding. Ricardo and Clara started meeting casually, always keeping their feet firmly planted in the reality of what had happened. He never pressured her for more than she was willing to give, and Clara, in turn, allowed herself to see Ricardo's more vulnerable side. During one of their meetings, Ricardo confessed something he had never told anyone. "You know, I grew up thinking I had to prove something to everyone," he said as they walked through a park. "My father always said weakness was unacceptable, and I spent my life trying to show I was strong. But when I met you, Clara, I realized true strength is about being honest with yourself." Clara was silent for a moment before responding. "I learned something from all of this too. I learned that my dignity doesn't depend on what others think of me but on what I think of myself." Ricardo smiled, and in that instant, Clara realized the man beside her was someone she barely recognized, but in the best possible way. He had shed his masks, leaving only his true self. 6 months after that reunion on the bench, Clara and Ricardo were together again, but this time on a completely different foundation. There were no promises of perfection or illusions of an idealized love. There were simply two people willing to learn, grow, and love in a genuine way. At the NGO's anniversary celebration, Clara gave an emotional speech about the importance of resilience and inner strength. When she finished, she looked out into the audience at Ricardo and smiled. He wasn't the hero of her story, but now she knew she didn't need one. She was her own heroine, and he was just someone fortunate enough to walk beside her. Together, they discovered that love wasn't a perfect fairy tale but an ongoing process of choice, forgiveness, and learning. Do you think Clara made the right decision in forgiving Ricardo? Share your thoughts in the comments. On a scale of 0 to 10, how would you rate this story? If you enjoyed it, make sure to subscribe to our channel, and we'll see you in the next video.